My name is Nigel. I'm from the University of the West of England in Bristol. I'm joined by Iian from the Mendip school, and we're going to talk about a collaborative project we've done within a school involving virtual reality, head-mounted display technology with autistic groups. So the presentation is just going to briefly cover why we consider virtual reality a good fit and a potential learning aid for autistic groups. And as I said, Mark's already picked up on some of those affordances. A bit of background and context and a history to virtual reality used for these populations. I'm then going to talk through a project that we've done within a school and in a cultural setting using virtual reality and talk through some of the findings and some of the interesting things that we've seen and picked up. And then we're going to try to kind of synthesize some messages for ways in which teachers, practitioners, teaching assistants and so on could potentially use virtual reality in schools and a way to potentially take that forward. So some of the lessons we've learnt. Future challenges, responsibilities and ethics and health and safety around using this particular technology will also be picked up on. So as I think has already been underlined quite well and presented earlier, computers and applied technologies have been shown to support autistic users in terms of initiating interactions, slowing down communication processes, reducing cognitive pressures around the need for face-to-face channels of communication. They can often provide a voice to be heard. Yesterday I was in a meeting when we were talking about the role of PECs and sort of PECs on iPads and stuff being a really important way of somebody who can't verbalize communicating. They can also enable creative expression, which sometimes I think gets forgotten within this sort of bigger picture. They can be a way to support and test social situations, and a key thing, especially in terms of virtual reality, without real-world consequences, which is a real sort of draw in some cases for autistic populations. A space to learn communication skills, in some cases recognize facial expression. There's been a bit of work done around that, and of course others. And mainly the sort of premise or the thesis for this is because technology can be, and I've underlined can be, if it's designed appropriately and with different stakeholder groups, it can be predictable and controllable. It's not always socially complex or unnecessarily complex. It can be less worrying and stressful for some groups. It can be a space to test and therefore remove stresses associated with the real-life consequences. And it can provide a means to control, as designers and as researchers, it can be a space where we can control and design and modify content and how that content is potentially presented to and delivered to autistic groups. And also, I think it's really important to point out, again, I think as Mark has sort of underlined, that it really plays to the strengths of autistic communities in terms of technology or technologies. So in terms of the broader picture, in terms of virtual reality and autism research, this is just a figure that kind of gives you a sense from the 1990s through to 2017, the kind of reported research in the literature. You can see here there's a steady growth and kind of a big explosion around 2012, 13, or 13, when we start to see, am I okay on this? I'm okay on this. I'm a walker, so yeah, you can still hear me okay, thank you. And also I can see these data. Yeah, so it's from 1996 when virtual reality was first introduced in a research arena through to 2017. And about here, this is where we see commercially available, affordable technologies becoming available, namely the Oculus Rift and other similar technologies. And I think that's probably one reason for that kind of sharp increase at that point. When we start to look at where these data are being reported in terms of around the world, we can see that the USA is very much leading research in this area, followed by the UK. So I think as researchers in this country, I think we're quite well positioned, and certainly I'm going to talk a bit about the location in Bristol, how we're quite well positioned for that, to undertake some of this research. But that just gives you a sense of where this research is taking place and the sort of period of time and how the research and the evidence base, which I'll come back to, so I think is really important, that sort of goes alongside this work, is sort of situated. So we know, in summary, these are all the reasons that we're using this technology, but as Mark pointed out, I think the link between generalization and what we're attempting to achieve using technologies isn't always generalized to the real world. Now, virtual environments and virtual reality, I would suggest, not to contradict Mark, but kind of to add to that thought, that there has been some data reported around greater opportunities of generalization using those particular technologies. So that's why I think that's one reason we're quite interested in exploring these. So the earliest sort of use of virtual reality, head-mounted displays, is this, and there's some kit outside that you can experiment with after this as well that I've brought along. So if you want to sort of see what this looks like, there'll be some visuals as we go through, but there is a chance to test this. This was the very first study carried out in '96 in California by Dorothy Strickland and colleagues. You can see it's based in a research lab. It's a very big, heavy, weighted device, lots of cables, lots of expensive equipment behind that, enabling that to work. And the graphics you can see also are very, I would describe as sort of basic. They're of their time, shall we say. And in this study, they were interested whether autistic people would wear and accept the technology with some known sensory concerns that autistic people present with. Also, they wanted to know if this technology could be used to sort of develop skills, and in this case, it was about crossing a road safely. And they concluded sort of yes and yes for that. It was a very small study that should be pointed out in terms of participants. However, the next study to examine head-mounted displays used by autistic groups and involving autistic groups in the research was 2015, 2016. So there's a big gap. And that's primarily, I would argue, to do with the costs, the portability, the actual, how can we use this in our day-to-day real lives. So when this technology became more portable and more affordable, we start to see research sort of re-emerging. And the work that we did in 2016, we wanted to ask, as it says here, a sample population, their views and experiences about this technology. Just before this point, there was a load of press and media speculation saying virtual reality is a perfect fit for autistic people, it can be a great learning tool and so on. But there was no evidence to suggest that they would be willing to wear it, and there was no data to suggest whether or not they might feel negative impact as a result of wearing it. There are known dizziness, nauseousness, sickness, contexts that exist within wearing head-mounted displays. So nobody had asked those target population any of those questions, and that's what we wanted to explore. But it's also worth pointing out, and I put this in as Mark was speaking, as you mentioned about social media, but just about this point was when Oculus was bought by Facebook. So I think there would be some speculation that head-mounted displays in VR is being seen as a form of connecting people socially. So it's an interesting connection, I think, with the work you were exploring earlier. So what we wanted to do was, would they be willing to wear head-mounted display? If so, how would they experience the environments that we're presenting to them? And would they feel sick? Would they feel okay in these environments? And so what we were able to do in 2016, as when this was 2015-16, we were able to portably take this kit from the UK to the US to undertake a pilot study. We were able to work in situ, so we were able to work in a centre that employed autistic people in this particular case, and we were able to take all of that to them and ask their views around how do they experience different virtual environments, and did they experience any negative effects. We also measured anxiety before and after using the head-mounted display. And really what we found was, we found an overwhelming willingness to wear the equipment. So all of the groups, all of the participants we worked with, 40, were willing to wear the headset and experience at least 3 different experiences. They were able to use input devices and navigate basic scenes. There was a range of different scenes we provided them with. And they were also demonstrating some body interactions involved in that, so getting up, moving about, and wanting to do stuff physically. There was a self-reported high level of presence and immersion and ecological validity, which I think is important because that links to generalization. I think the greater that stuff exists, the greater the chance for generalizing into a real-world scenario. But most importantly, they reported low negative effects, and they reported not feeling dizzy and not feeling sick, especially when compared to screen-based media. They reported lower negative effects than traditional screen-based media. We also found that anxiety was not increased after using the head-mounted display. I'm not suggesting it decreases anxiety, but what we wanted to do was just ensure that it didn't sort of increase anxiety, and we found evidence to suggest that it didn't increase anxiety after using the head-mounted display. So that's a piece of work we did back in 2015-16 to sort of explore, is this a feasible technology, by going into autistic populations and asking those important questions. But more recently, in 2018, we looked at a meta-analysis. We looked at all the data around head-mounted displays in education for autistic groups. And we concluded that whilst there are some good grounds for optimism, more research is needed on the use of this technology within educational settings. So there's a big gap still that exists, I think, between this particular technology and working in educational settings to ensure robust recommendations can be made on the implementation, use, and sustainability of this particular tool. And we'll come back to that later in terms of, I think, working in schools. And it goes on to suggest one of the main criticisms in this field has been the lack of involvement from practitioners in research on educational approaches to autistic populations, and the gap between research and practice in real-life settings really exists. So we wanted to take, again, this technology into school as a researcher going into a school, working with colleagues in a school, working with autistic pupils within a school, and sort of embedding that technology and asking some similar questions to the initial study within that setting, and asking the groups what they would see the potential of this technology, and also asking the teachers what they saw, the barriers and the positive opportunities for this technology. So what we did was, we went into 4 schools, one of which was the Mendip school near Shepton Mallet, and we took in 3 different devices, because we weren't necessarily convinced that taking in a piece of kit that by the time you had a high-spec computer with, you're talking in excess of about $2,500 was necessarily going to be the way forward for schools. So we wanted to explore very low-tech options, something like the Google Cardboard here, and another device that's more commercially available and apparently a good fit for schools called Class VR. Is there anybody here from that organisation before I continue? Okay. So they're one like Mark's sort of warning. There are no sort of interests here in terms we have no interest within either of these sort of 3 devices. So we just wanted to get a sort of a grounded understanding of what might be the most preferable device, what the teachers might see as the most usable device within their setting. So on the Google Cardboard device, we had sort of a moonscape where the users could navigate around the moon. It's a 360 environment. Again, you can experience this outside. On the Class VR, we had a bunch of static and video 360 environments. And because it's educationally focused, there's a bunch of different environments that you can visit from around the world. And this was inside one of the pyramids in Egypt, I think. And the final one was the HTC Vive, which has a lot more interactivity. You can use your hands and input. And this was visiting a fair and undertaking some sort of fairground activities. Oh, okay, so can we hit play on that, I wonder?
Yes, you can.
Yeah. So like I said, you can experience these outside if you're interested, but this just gives you a flavour of the sort of interfaces in terms of what they look like. So in all of these environments, you're the first person. So you put the goggles on and it's like you are the first person view where you're looking is. And you can see this has a lot of different interactions, a lot of things you need to sort of maneuver and do. This is a promotional video, so ignore all this stuff. But you get a sense that there's sort of fine motor skills required. In some cases, collaboration, because not only can you only see this, but the people in the room can also see on a screen what you're doing. So that was something we'll pick up on a bit. The next one was this, which was just inside, as I said earlier, a tomb within Egypt. And the final one was just a moonscape that the users could, oops, sorry. Very small. Where again, you could tour around the moon and just see different things and look around. This proved quite popular, actually, didn't it? It seems simple, but again, this is what we were looking to explore. You know, is there a need to have very complex devices, or can it be simplified? And this one actually proved quite relaxing. Yeah. So just to come to some of the data that we were interested in collecting. So we worked with the Mendip school, but we also worked with 2 mainstream schools. This has been noted already, I think, that the most autistic pupils are still embedded within sort of mainstream settings. So we wanted to look at mainstream settings, and we also wanted to look at 2 special provisions. And we worked with quite an age range, actually, which is something that hasn't taken place in this field in terms of virtual reality yet. So we worked with, as you can see, from 4 to sort of 18-year-olds within this particular project. The next slide gives you a bit of information in terms of the sort of breakdown of that, I guess, across each of those schools, in terms of the female, male, the breakdown, the average ages, and so on. So we work with primary schools, secondary schools, and special and mainstream settings. So in terms of the first measure, we designed a questionnaire which was sort of built to ask them essentially what was their sort of preferred and least preferred device. And it's probably no surprise to sort of see that the HTC, because of the quality of the graphics maybe, the sort of sense of immersion and presence and so on, was reported as one of the highest sort of preferred devices, followed by the Google Cardboard, which, as I said, they did seem to enjoy that interface. But, yeah, unfortunately, the one that is built for this, I would caveat that we didn't explore all of the possibilities with any of these devices. So there could be a lot more in terms of in the can that we could do with these. So it's not to say that we explored all the different sort of ins and outs of these technologies. But you can see here when, again, the least, not only was this not the preferred, but it was also the least preferred device across the groups that we worked with. And we worked with, was it on this setting, the total? We worked with 43 pupils in total, ranging from 6 to, actually should be 18 on there, with a mean age of 12, and we worked with, 73%, 27% sort of autistic, typically developing groups. So that's what they reported in terms of the device preference. So that starts to give us some information to work with, I think, as we start to take this forward. We then also asked all of the students a range of questions, and we put those into 3 factors. The first factor was around the enjoyment and the usefulness of the technology and what they were using. The second one was around the physical experience, sort of negative experience, positive experience of feeling the device and how that felt. And the third was, would they use it again or recommend that this is used in their class or, or to their friends. And you can see across these identifiers at the bottom of the 4 schools, and you can see these are the 3 factors for each of the schools. And you can see the average. We asked them to rate the questions on a scale of 1 to 4, and you can see here the mean averages across that are quite high, I would suggest, in terms of both the enjoyment for factor 1, the physical experiences being very positively reported, but also wanting to use it again was almost a 4 in terms of wanting to use it again. So, as Mark said, like any young, individual, autistic or otherwise, I think there's a want and an excitement around using this technology. And so we, feel it's only, but we did want to explore that and ask those questions of this particular community, both typically developing and autistic in this case. In terms of what they thought that the technology could be best used for, having experienced some of those interfaces and others, you can see again the highest one sort of in terms of the report here was, it relaxes me and I feel calm. So a lot of the pupils, I think, identified this technology as somewhere that they could kind of decompress, they could feel relaxed. And I think that bears out in some of the computer-mediated work that Mark was talking about in terms of communicating on their own time and having their own space in there. So essentially, some of the qualitative comments, it relaxes me and I feel calm. I could develop learning opportunities for school in this with some of the stuff that came from the participants. And I can go places virtually and see what they look like as well. So the idea of alleviating stress potentially before they go somewhere in the real world, seeing it here. And I'm going to talk about a brief project we did with that, moving on from that. I'm conscious of time. I don't want to babble or get through this too quickly, but we also asked the teachers' viewpoints of what they saw. They had a chance to experience the technology themselves, and they also had the chance to see their children using the technology. So you can see here some of the sort of feedback were around interactive experiences, tours of visits before the visit happens in real life, and we did a small project on that. This is the technology pupils have a grasp of and get excited about, and we have a duty to include this in their learning experiences. And I think I had a conversation with somebody earlier around, are we really training teachers accordingly about the role of technology and how that can be embedded and used? So that's a question mark. It was amazing to see how pupils who don't normally speak to each other began supporting each other and communicating positively. Again, supports that positive nature of the technology. Subjects like history, we could experience places that might be talked about in order for children to relate more to those experiences. Again, school trips to engage students in their work and make lessons more interesting, and children could learn in a potentially therapeutic environment. Did you have anything to add as a teacher perspective, what you saw there?
No, not really. I think everything is on there, really.
However, it's not without challenges, as we know. I think we're all sat here, on the shared understanding that technology in schools presents a range of different barriers and challenges. So the teachers said it could be difficult to get some students off VR, potentially. I think that's any student, and as Mark suggested, any youngster. Appropriate space in classrooms came up, and you can see I've put this one here. This device involves a lot of cabling and a lot of different sort of sensors. These don't, so the issue of space becomes a factor in which device might be more preferable. Class sizes and experience, so I think this was around the ICT experience as teachers, potentially in deploying this and having the confidence to do that. If it needs to be plugged in, it might become more difficult for kids in the classroom. They could become distracted, it could become problematic, and the health and safety issues, I guess, around that, and of course the cost barrier. So what this starts to tell us is that there is a potential good fit between head-mounted display, virtual reality technologies, and autistic groups from their and their teachers' perspectives, which is what this piece of work sought to do. The negative effects remain relatively low, I think, is what the students reported. And there's an excitement, and I want to use this, and that's very high amongst the autistic groups. Comparing the autistic and typically developing groups, it was higher in the autistic groups. So we think there is potential to consider investigating this. And one of the pieces of work we did, sort of extending that and building on some of the feedback, was during the Science Week that Ian mentioned. They had a bunch of activities in the school, and part of that was to visit a museum called We the Curious in Bristol. And so what we did was we worked with a local company called Go Virtually, who is a resident of the Bristol VR Lab. So just a quick plug there for those two things. But Go Virtually, Rachel actually designed this app, free of charge. She did it because she saw it as an interesting opportunity. And the Bristol VR Lab is something that's just recently been funded in Bristol, and it's a good point of connection between some of the work that we're doing. So we feel it's a good time to be doing some of this work. And Go Virtually designed a 3D tour, an interactive 3D tour, a virtual reality tour of the museum, We the Curious. But before I get to that, what we wanted to do with this piece of work was use a lower tech, so we used the Google Cardboard, and we wanted to assess whether or not the VR app could support the visit to a new and unusual space the students hadn't visited before, and whether or not it could be applied in the classroom before a visit to the real-world environment. So this is what it looks like. Again, you can experience this outside if you would like. It's essentially a 3D tour. You're immersed. It's as if you're in the space. You look at the wee blue dots in the app. You look at them online. You can click them, and it transports you around and into different parts of the museum. So the students had a chance to spend 10, 15 minutes in the VR space before they visited the museum.
We already sorted out the children that had been to the museum before, and we kept them to one side, and then we sort of exposed some children that hadn't been before and children that we knew had anxieties around going to new places, and we exposed them to this for, was it 5? It was between 5 and 10 minutes.
It was 5 and 10 minutes, yeah.
They just got a gentle exposure to it, and then there was a questionnaire about how it made them feel. Did they like it? Didn't they like it? But what was very interesting was, whilst they were sat down in the classroom looking through the museum, again, they were sort of taught, they couldn't link it, but they were talking to each other. If I go left, I can see this. If I go right, I can see that. And you'll notice off the video, there's no people in that tour. It's all blank. There's nobody there, which was completely unlike when we went there, when there was 11 other schools, and the space observatory wasn't working that day, and it took 5 minutes to get the tickets, and they just wanted to go. But what was really interesting is the kids that had been there before, they just go off and they go off. But I kept an eye on all the kids that had been exposed. And they were talking to each other, and they already had in their minds where they were going. They'd already mapped their route, and they were talking to each other. I said, do you remember where that is? Let's go there now. And it was like the other schools weren't there. They knew where they were going. And all of that pressure was taken off. It just didn't exist for them. There's a lovely picture, actually. It's the one by the little... No, keep going forward.
I don't think I have it.
You took it off. There's a boy, one of the youngest participants. He's 10 years old, and he really has serious anxiety about going to new places. He will scream, he will cry, he will punch, he will run off. And we got in there, and he knew he wanted to go straight to where the hammers were. There's like a little... you hit the hammer and it pops up somewhere else, and it was about air pressure. No, I don't really know. But he ran off, and he just there, boom, 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 and he looked at his teacher, finished, and shot off to the next one. And it was just such a lovely day for him. And we actually got a phone call off his mum the day after, and she said he's never had so much fun anywhere. He hasn't stopped talking about it since 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon, and he still talks about it now. When are we going to the museum again? Now that boy, previous to this, would never have done that. He just would not have gone. It really was amazing for him.
And I think it's important to stress that we're not suggesting it was definitely because of the VR experience. No. I think it's worth pointing that out. This was just a very small-scale study with 11 autistic children at the Mendip school across this age range. We asked them some questions related to their experiences visiting museums and cultural spaces. They had a chance to experience the VR tour. They completed follow-up questions. They then went to the museum in real life, and then we did some sort of post-museum questions. Of course, we checked at all times, around cyber sickness and negative effects, while we were going an eye strain and so on. They went, and what we generally found was, again, sort of positive sort of suggestions that, the app helped them to understand what to expect. It prepared them for the visit. They found it relaxing. Again, this was on a scale of 1 to 4. So this, again, you see there's very positive sort of murmurings towards, would you like to use this more? Yes, there's, again, positivity around this sort of tool. We found that, again, using the app first helped me to visualize the space before I visited. The VR app helped me to enjoy the visit more than if I hadn't have used the app. So they're starting to make some, in this case, some connections between how the VR experience could have helped support them in that, in that. There are some also data that suggests, they found it loud and distracted, not really. So maybe it didn't help with their ability to sort of manage some of those things, but it certainly sort of tends to suggest, again, that there is some potential role for this technology to play. So yes, we found, sort of concluding from that particular really small scale project, that the VR app potentially helped to relax and calm the groups. It seemed to help them know what to expect before they visited the museum. It helped to alleviate issues of confusion of where to go, as you mentioned, how to navigate it. It helped them visualize the space just before they went there, and the reports of the museums being distracting were similar before and after. So the VR app didn't necessarily, intervene or play a role in that particular context. So overall, from this sort of small set of projects that we've been working sort of in schools, I think in terms of some thoughts and sort of some conclusions, I think the use of low-tech options could prove very useful. It doesn't have to be a high-cost, high-tech sort of solution in terms of VR. I would suggest experimenting by downloading free content that links with curriculum to see how VR could be used in your classroom, using Google Cardboard here for £5. Mark's already said, 95% of people have smartphones now. So maybe they bring smartphones, maybe you need to, maybe there's an outlay of buying some smartphones, but using YouTube and a Google Cardboard that you'll see outside, it's a very cheap, affordable first step into using VR. And there's a lot of content available, freely available, and thinking about how that links to different parts of the curriculum, which we did. Considering the use of VR for calming and reducing issues in classroom, for a change of sensory experience, we think it could hold some potential benefits for. So instead of having a room to go to, it could be that VR could play a role in helping to bring somebody back. So I think these are in terms of some of the questions we thought might come up from this, we want to kind of address those. So how could you use VR in your classrooms? We think you'll definitely need to make some space and time to try things. I think that's really important to point out. Using the cardboard as a head-mounted display is fine and adequate for the work that we've sort of investigated so far. We found very limited, if any, reasons to believe that a head-mounted display can be negative in terms of negative experiences, but that doesn't mean we don't need to tread carefully and ensure health and safety and sort of ethical concerns are considered at all times. The use of a YouTube app with a Google Cardboard is absolutely fine as a starting point, I think, if this is something you're interested in trying. Trying a range of different sort of content. There's a lot of National Geographic content available, for example, which I would imagine would link with history and potentially geography quite well. And finding a potential selection of relaxing content as well, different sort of media, relaxing content where students can go and relax and sort of, like I say, normalize maybe if they've got very excited. And I think you will need to expect some teachers, facilitators, teaching assistants, whoever would be sort of championing this work, would need to invest some time researching what content is best, most suitable, and try it out and make sure it sort of seems to match with where you're wanting to go with it. And as it says here, there's no recommendations we can provide to say, if you use this in this way, it will help with this. That's the work that we're going to be needing to do next, I think, in this particular field. And in terms of bridging that gap, in terms of getting technology into schools, I think Ian has some sort of...
It was really, I mean, we were lucky because we were able to sort of try before you buy, which in education is an exceptionally rare thing. You normally go and see things like this at fairs and you think, oh yeah, that'll be great, let's go and buy one. And then they just never come out for the next 5 years because no one learns how to use them. And schools are in that sort of process right now where they're putting their priorities in place for the coming year. You know, the school improvement plans, what do we want to do to improve? And out of that, you obviously identify your needs. What is it you're trying to do? What are you trying to achieve? What do you want to use it for? And one thing I would say is you've got to look at what you're currently doing, because 9 times out of 10 what you're currently doing is absolutely fine. And you know, you don't need to worry about trying something new. And I think sometimes in education we always rush to try something new, and actually sometimes what we're doing is absolutely fine. You know, how effective is what you're doing right now? And we were talking about the example of travel training. So travel training can be really hard for some of our older children. They can have anxieties about going over the roads and whatever. So how do you get that starting point? Well, actually, if there's an app that we can download into a virtual environment where a child can experience crossing a road or walking through a park or seeing heavy traffic and loud noise, that's a really good starting point for them. Would that support their next step and make it more effective? Well, yes, it would. And that's the thing about what we're talking about, is a lot of the niche areas of teaching that aren't necessarily on the curriculum. You know, the whole, I'm lucky because I work in a multi-academy trust, so I wouldn't have to put the full outlay for a VR kit onto my budget. What I could do is I could talk to the other partner schools and say, look, we're looking at getting this. If we all chip in X percentage, we could share it as a resource and we can pop it around. And the great benefit of that, of course, is there's 9 schools in our multi-academy trust, so that will mean 9 people are trained in using that piece of equipment. And the more people you train, the more effective it gets used and the more regularly it gets used. And that's the other thing you have to factor in. No matter how much this equipment costs, be prepared to spend that on training as well. Because whatever you buy technology-wise, we've all been into the schools that have bought 30, 40, 50 iPads and then never trained staff on how to use them. You know, and that's a common misconception, that you can just take them out of the box. Yes, you can, but you won't be effectively using them. You know, so you have to invest in training with this. And then, you know, once you have bought it, you have to commit to the research in it and getting the results and seeing the effects. You know, I suggested that actually you would need to see 5 years of cyclical results just to see the benefit of what the VR was bringing. You know, effectively a key stage or 2 key stages. You know, see how that has impacted the children. There is the cost issue. You can alleviate it. We've talked about Google Cardboard, it is cheap, but the fully immersive experiences at the moment are very costly. So if you can spread that cost, if you work within an academy trust and you can spread that outlay, it makes accessibility a lot easier for you.
And I think on that note, it then potentially can promote collaboration, can't it, between those sites and, and colleagues as well. And I think that picks up quite nicely then on the... So I think, maybe I haven't drawn out, and I'll say it just to make sure it is there, this research in virtual reality head-mounted displays and autistic groups in schools is at a very early stage of development. There's very limited evidence, there's very limited data at the moment. We're trying to sort of push that forward, I think, through these type of projects and working with autistic communities, with teachers, with schools to find out what's best and how we can work with this. And I think as we move forward to develop that evidence base, we need to ensure collaboration. Again, it sounds obvious, but it's something this area can't grow and scale and have impact without. And as researchers, we don't traditionally collaborate that well, and I think that's something that certainly has changed and needs to change. We need evidence, as Ian has said, to evaluate the work that we're doing and the outcomes that that's having. We need content. Content is the biggest issue at the moment, specific content to help develop specific skills within the autistic sort of spectrum. Some hardware is freely available now. It's not that expensive, comparatively speaking, but there is a need to sort of develop specific content and think about what that looks like. We need to align, in terms of aligned to evidence, we need to ensure that the content is well aligned to evidence and that it can be shown to be beneficial. How, where, when, why. We need to, with researchers, we need to provide that guidance and that sort of structure. And most importantly, I think access, placing this tech in the hands of the users who can benefit. There's no point of us doing this in research labs. There's no point of us doing it just in a small scale way. We need to make sure that if this tech can be beneficial, that it's in the hands of the people who can benefit. And finally, obviously, involving community, autistic communities and groups in this research and we heard it from Mark, and I think it's definitely something in the UK that I think we're doing quite well, actually, in terms of collaborating with autistic communities to ask their experiences. And we've started with a bit of ground-up research, and I think now we can sort of got some good building blocks to take this these lines of inquiries further and hopefully develop some of these bespoke content and evaluate it further. So just to sort of conclude, thank you very much for the invite to be here and for us both to present some of this work. Thanks to the NAS and the organisers. Thanks also to my autistic research mentor, Adam. I think Adam's there. So Adam has provided really useful insights to me as a researcher to ways that I can approach this work before I get too involved with this work. So before I even start formulating research questions, working with somebody in the autistic community, to have a conversation around those has been very important and very much appreciated, so thank you. And thanks to the schools, obviously, that participated, and most importantly, the participants. And I think there is some kit outside you can use in terms of what you've seen on here, and I think we're going to take some questions, aren't we, sort of as a panel with Mark. So thank you.